You don't end up in Rezina prison by accident. This place, the worst of Moldova's concrete graves, is where they bury you alive without needing to dig a hole. The walls are too high, the guards too mean, and the days stretch so long they blur into one endless punishment. But I wasn't planning to die here. My name's Alexei Morozov. Before all this, I was an engineer in Chisinau, the kind of guy who fixed problems no one else could. That's probably why they thought I'd survive in here. But fixing things wasn't going to cut it this time. Not with a 25-year sentence for a crime I didn't commit. At first, escape wasn't even a thought, it was fantasy. Something the desperate whisper about in the dark, like kids telling ghost stories, only here, the ghosts were real, and the guards made sure of it. You try to keep your head down, serve your time, and pray the system spits you out alive. But systems like this don't spit people out. They grind you down until you're nothing but a number. And every day that passed, I could feel it happening, my name fading, my future disappearing. Until the night I saw the crack. It wasn't much. A loose tile in the back corner of my cell, barely big enough to slide a coin through. But that's the thing about cracks, they're never just cracks. They're signs that even the strongest walls can break. I spent weeks watching the guards, memorizing their routines. Every shift change, every smoke break, every blind spot the cameras couldn't quite cover. I learned who was lazy, who was mean, and, most importantly, who wasn't paying attention when they should have been. The weak points were there. I just had to find a way to stitch them together. There was one guy in here who could help me figure it out, Nikolai. Old-timer, the kind of man who'd seen more prison yards than daylight. His hands shook from years of bad prison medicine, but his eyes? His eyes were sharp. I approached him during yard time, trying not to seem too eager. In a place like Rezina, eagerness gets you killed. I need a map, I muttered under my breath, close enough that only he could hear. He didn't look at me right away. Just lit a cigarette with those shaking hands and took a long drag. Nobody gets out of Rezina, he said, voice low and gravelly. I leaned in closer. Nobody's tried with me before. That got his attention. The thing about planning an escape is it's like solving a puzzle, every piece has to fit just right, or the whole thing falls apart. I started by getting assigned to the maintenance crew, not glamorous, but it gave me access to the pipes, the vents, and, most importantly, the forgotten corners of the prison nobody cared about anymore. The old Soviet construction was full of flaws. Decades of neglect left cracks not just in the walls but in the routines of the guards and the arrogance of the system. They believed this place was unbreakable. That's always the first mistake. The hardest part wasn't the planning. It was waiting. Months passed, and every day I woke up thinking, is this the day I try? Is this the day it all ends, one way or another? But patience isn't just a virtue in prison. It's survival. The window of opportunity came during a storm, the kind of thunder that shakes the ground, the kind that makes the lights flicker. The perfect distraction. I remember lying on my bunk, staring at the ceiling as the rain pounded the roof, counting the seconds between the lightning flashes and the crack of thunder. 1. 2. 3. That's when I knew. My time had come. I didn't just want out. I needed out. Every man here was a prisoner of something, guilt, regret, or just bad luck. But me? I wasn't guilty of the crime they pinned on me. The real criminals were out there, walking free, living the life that had been stolen from me. And if I had to crawl through hell to take it back, so be it. Because the only thing harder than breaking out of Rezina? Surviving long enough to matter once you're free. You don't realize how loud silence can be until you're crawling through the guts of a prison, every scrape of your breath echoing like gunfire in your own head. That's where I was, wedged into a forgotten maintenance shaft beneath Rezina prison, inches from suffocating, and counting every second like it was my last. The storm outside was raging, thunder booming across the sky like cannon fire. It was the perfect cover. Every flash of lightning overhead meant another second the cameras would glitch, another moment where the guards were too busy cursing the power surge to notice a shadow slipping out of place. I wasn't just escaping a prison. I was escaping their version of me. The shaft was narrower than I'd expected. My chest scraped against rusted metal pipes as I crawled inch by inch through the darkness, every movement slow and calculated. I couldn't afford mistakes. One wrong move, one loud noise, and I'd be dragged out of there with a bullet in the back of my skull. I reached the first checkpoint, a rusted grate bolted into the floor of the boiler room. This was the part of the prison nobody visited unless something was broken, which meant no guards, no cameras. Just machines humming like an iron heartbeat. I pulled the small wrench I'd smuggled from the maintenance shop out of my waistband and got to work on the bolts. Every turn of the metal felt like an earthquake. My hands shook from the cold and the fear, but I kept going, my breath shallow and steady. 1 bolt. 2. By the third, sweat poured down my forehead, stinging my eyes. Don't stop. The final bolt gave way with a soft metallic click, and I gently lifted the grate free, sliding it to the side without a sound. I didn't celebrate. There was no victory in halfway. The next part of the plan was the hardest. I had to cross the boiler room floor. It sounds simple until you realize that every inch of that space was surrounded by motion sensors, an upgrade installed after an attempted escape a few years back. I had studied the patterns for months, watching from maintenance windows, memorizing every blink of the little red lights. The sensors had a blind spot, a narrow, 2-foot gap along the floor where the pipes threw off their readings. I flattened myself to the cold concrete and began to crawl again, slower this time, every muscle screaming for mercy. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would trip the alarms. My fingers clawed forward, pulling me through the gap like some desperate animal digging its way out of a cage. Inch by inch. A single bead of sweat dripped from my temple, landing with a faint tap on the ground. I froze. The lights above flickered as another roll of thunder cracked through the sky. A lucky break. The sound covered the drop, and the motion sensors stayed dead. Keep moving. I reached the far wall of the boiler room, where an old service ladder led upward toward the air filtration system. The ladder was coated in rust, the metal flaking off beneath my fingers. I climbed anyway, each step another test of whether my luck, or my body, would give out first. At the top, there was a ventilation grate just big enough to squeeze through. I pulled out the shiv I had hidden in my boot, wedging it between the screws until they popped loose one by one. The vent smelled of mold and rat droppings, but it was freedom, or at least the closest thing to it I'd tasted in 5 years. I crawled through the ductwork until I found my next marker, a faint trickle of cold air seeping through the cracks, signaling the outer wall wasn't far. But then came the sound that froze my blood. Voices. Guards. 2 of them, passing below the vent. Their boots echoed against the tile like war drums. I'm telling you, the cameras glitched again, one said, his voice thick with boredom. It's the storm, the other replied. We'll check the yard later. Nothing ever happens during the rodeo. I held my breath, flattening myself against the metal as they passed below me, their words fading into silence. Nothing ever happens. They were wrong. I reached the final grate, this one newer, cleaner, probably replaced during the last round of prison upgrades. It led directly outside, just beyond the wall near the trash incinerator. The perfect blind spot, no cameras, no guards, because who in their right mind would try to escape through fire? I gripped the edges of the vent, testing the screws. Tight. I needed leverage. I pulled the wrench from my belt again, working the screws loose one agonizing turn at a time. The storm was weakening now, every second of silence another risk of being heard. The final screw dropped. The grate came free. Cold air rushed into my lungs as I stared out at the darkness beyond the walls. But freedom had one last guardian, the outer fence. 30 feet of razor wire and steel, humming with electricity like the pulse of the prison itself. I had planned for this. During my maintenance shifts, I'd buried a length of rubber insulation and a makeshift hook behind the incinerator. The guards never checked the waste pits, it smelled too foul for anyone to care. I unearthed it quickly, wrapping the rubber around my hands to protect myself from the live current. I hooked the rope high, securing it on the first try. The fence hummed beneath me as I climbed. Halfway up, I felt it, the buzz of power leaking through the insulation. My hands burned. My vision blurred. But I didn't stop. At the top, I paused just long enough to hook the rope around the barbed wire and pull myself over the edge, every inch of exposed skin screaming as the sharp metal bit into me. I hit the ground hard. The alarms hadn't sounded. Not yet. But I knew better than to think I was free. The hard part wasn't climbing the fence. The hard part was disappearing before Resina Prison even realized I was gone. Hitting the ground outside Resina should have felt like freedom, but instead, all I felt was pain, a white-hot lance ripping through my side as I rolled to a stop in the mud. The fall had been harder than I'd planned, and the jagged teeth of the razor wire had taken their toll. My shirt stuck to me, soaked through with blood and sweat, and the cold night air bit into every cut. But pain was a luxury for later. I forced myself up, crouching low in the wet grass, eyes locked on the prison behind me. The searchlights kept sweeping the yard, but nothing had changed yet. No alarms. No sirens. Just the storm fading into a drizzle and the heavy silence of a place that didn't yet know it had failed. Move, I told myself. I bolted for the tree lean, using the cover of shadows as my shield. Every second was a gamble. If they spotted me now, I wouldn't have time to run. I'd be dragged back inside, or worse, shot dead on the edge of freedom. The trees swallowed me whole, and for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd made it. That's when I heard it. Snap. A sharp crack echoed through the dark, a broken branch underfoot. I froze, dropping low behind a tangle of roots. My breath hitched, shallow and quick, ears straining for movement. Another snap. Not mine this time. Voices followed, low, clipped, urgent. Sector 3 clear. Moving south, someone barked into a radio. They were already in the woods. I was supposed to have more time. By my calculations, the guards wouldn't notice I was missing for another 30 minutes. Something had tipped them off early, maybe a camera rebooting too soon, maybe a guard with better instincts than the others. Either way, the net was tightening faster than I'd planned. I crawled through the underbrush, every movement measured, careful not to disturb the brittle twigs and dead leaves beneath me. The patrol was getting closer, too close. I could see the faint glint of a flashlight cutting through the rain-soaked air just a few meters away. And then came the dogs. The low growl hit me first, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws ripping into the dirt. They were tracking me. I needed distance. I spotted a shallow ditch up ahead, half filled with water from the storm. Without thinking, I slid into it, submerging myself just enough to mask my scent. The water was ice-cold, cutting through the adrenaline like glass shards in my veins. The patrol moved closer, too close. A flashlight beam swept across the ditch, lingering for half a second too long. My heart stopped, lungs screaming for air as I sank lower into the freezing water. Then, silence. The light moved on. I stayed under for as long as I could, every muscle cramping from the cold. When I finally surfaced, the forest was quieter, the guards had moved farther south, drawn by false trails I'd left near the outer fence. But I was running out of time. My body was shaking now, not from fear, but from exhaustion and the creeping sickness of the cuts across my side. Infection wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty if I didn't get help soon. I stumbled forward, deeper into the woods, toward the old logging road I had planned to reach by dawn. If I made it there, I could hitch a ride or find an abandoned truck, anything to put distance between me and Resina. But that's when it happened. My foot hit a patch of slick mud, and before I could react, I was falling, hard. My head slammed against a buried rock, and the world around me tilted, went gray, and collapsed inward. I woke up to daylight burning through the trees. I blinked, disoriented, my head pounding with every heartbeat. My side throbbed where the razor wire had torn into me, and the taste of iron filled my mouth. How long had I been out? I forced myself to sit up, my vision swimming in and out of focus. The sun was too high, midday, maybe later. I'd lost hours. And worse, far worse, I heard the low hum of an engine nearby. I crawled up the edge of the ditch toward the road. A military truck was parked at the edge of the clearing, its engine idling low, and two guards stood outside, rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. They weren't searching yet, probably taking a break from the overnight hunt, but if they saw me, it would be over. The road I needed was just behind them. The problem wasn't the distance. The problem was them. My body was wrecked, my head still bleeding, and every breath felt like I was sucking air through a straw. There was no way I could fight, and running wasn't an option, not in daylight, not across open ground. I reached for a rock by my side, weighing it in my hand. One distraction. One shot at slipping past. I threw the rock deep into the trees, the sound sharp and sudden. Both guards spun toward the noise instantly, their radios crackling as they called it in. That was my window. I crawled low through the underbrush, cutting behind the truck. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown to failure, but somehow, I made it to the edge of the road unseen. I didn't stop to think. I ran. The pain shot through my leg with every step, but I kept going, every breath burning like fire in my throat. Behind me, the radio chatter turned frantic. Movement on the north ridge, he's close. But by then, I was already gone, swallowed by the woods again. Bleeding. Broken. But still running. I didn't stop running until my lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. Every step was agony, my legs screamed with each movement, and the gash across my side burned like someone had set my skin on fire. The trees around me blurred into streaks of gray and green as I pushed deeper into the forest, farther from the road, farther from the guards. But not far enough. The barking of the dogs echoed through the woods behind me, sharp, vicious reminders that my mistakes were catching up. The fall, the lost hours, the distraction at the road, it had bought me time, but not nearly enough. I had to disappear. I found shelter as the sun sank behind the hills, an old hunting blind, half-collapsed, forgotten in the thickest part of the forest. The wooden planks groaned under my weight as I pulled myself inside, but at least it was cover from the searchlights now sweeping the sky above the trees. I collapsed against the wall, heart pounding like a sledgehammer. My hands trembled as I peeled off my shirt, trying to assess the damage. The cuts from the razor wire were deeper than I thought, jagged, angry slashes along my ribs, caked with dried blood and dirt. If infection hadn't set in yet, it would soon. I needed to clean the wounds, but all I had was a stolen canteen of muddy river water. Better than nothing. I poured it over the gashes, biting down on the inside of my cheek to keep from screaming. Every drop felt like acid on raw nerves, and black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I couldn't afford to pass out again. Stay awake. Just a little longer. The night was cold. Not the kind of cold that bites at your skin, but the kind that sinks into your bones and doesn't let go. I pulled my arms tight around myself, trying to stay warm, but the fever was already settling in, my skin burning hot one minute, freezing cold the next. Somewhere out in the darkness, I could still hear the dogs. They were close. Too close. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch made my heart leap into my throat. I wasn't going to survive another close call like the last one, not like this. My body was failing, and I knew it. I could feel it in the weakness of my limbs, the heaviness dragging down my eyelids. I needed help. But who the hell was going to help a fugitive? By morning, the fever was worse. My head was spinning, and every breath rattled in my chest like broken glass. I stumbled out of the hunting blind, using the trees to steady myself as I moved toward the east, where the rising sun burned weakly through the canopy. I had to get to a road. Any road. Even if it meant getting caught, better to die fighting than rot in the woods like an animal. But fate, or maybe sheer dumb luck, had one more card to play. Around midday, I found it. A dirt road, barely wide enough for a single car, cutting through the forest like a forgotten scar. I didn't hesitate. I staggered toward it, every step like dragging a corpse behind me. And then I heard it, the low hum of an engine. A small truck rounded the bend, kicking up dust as it crawled up the hill. I didn't think. I couldn't think. I stumbled into the middle of the road, waving my arms weakly. The driver hit the brakes hard, tires screeching against the dirt. The man behind the wheel was older, gray beard, sun-leathered skin, wearing a farmer's jacket and a cap pulled low over his eyes. "Jesus, kid," he muttered, jumping out of the truck. "What the hell happened to you?" I couldn't answer. My mouth opened, but no words came. The world spun again. And everything went black. I woke up on a rough cot in a small wooden cabin. The first thing I noticed was the heat, real heat, from a fire burning in an old cast-iron stove nearby. The second was the smell of antiseptic. Someone had cleaned my wounds. I tried to sit up, but a firm hand pressed me back down. "Easy," a voice said. "The farmer. You're lucky I didn't drive right past you. What were you doing out there?" I swallowed, my throat dry as sandpaper. "Just, lost." "Lost? Looks more like someone was hunting you." His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp, studying me like a man who'd seen trouble before. I didn't answer. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I don't know what you're running from, but I ain't the police. You need rest, food, and probably a doctor." I shook my head weakly. "No, can't stay here. They'll find me." "Them guards?" His jaw tightened. "Yeah, I figured." He didn't ask any more questions. Just handed me a bowl of soup and said, "Eat. Then we'll figure out what comes next." I stayed for 2 days. Long enough for the fever to break, for my body to stop shaking every time I tried to stand. The farmer, Vasile, didn't press for details, but I caught the way he looked at me sometimes, like he knew exactly the kind of man who ended up on the wrong side of a prison wall. On the third day, he handed me a map. "Roadblocks are still up along the main highways," he said, pointing at a winding back road near the southern border. "But if you cut through here, you might make it to Gagazia before they catch up." I folded the map carefully, meeting his eyes. "Why are you helping me?" He shrugged. "Everyone's running from something." That night, I left quietly, slipping out before dawn. I didn't say goodbye. Didn't leave a note. Some debts are better left unpaid. But as I disappeared into the cold gray dawn, map clenched tight in my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real chase hadn't even begun yet. The walls of Rezina were behind me. But the people hunting me? They weren't going to stop until I was dead. The road to Gagazia was more than just a line on a map, it was a thread of survival, stretching thin across the endless wilderness. Every step forward was a reminder of how much I had lost, and how much more I still had to lose if I slipped up now. The first 2 days on foot were brutal. My legs burned with every movement, and the pain in my side was like carrying a blade beneath my ribs. Vasilei's bandages helped, but the infection was still there, lurking beneath the surface of my skin like a loaded gun. I stayed off the main paths, moving through fields and abandoned farmlands where no one would think to look. The skies were heavy with rain, and the mud sucked at my boots with every step, slowing me down, making me easier to track. But the silence was worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching, like shadows were trailing just behind the edge of my vision. Every gust of wind felt like breath on the back of my neck. Every crack of a branch sent a jolt of panic through my chest. And the helicopters never stopped. I could hear them in the distance, slicing the sky apart with that low, mechanical hum. Searchlights sweeping through the dark like predators hunting for a flicker of movement. They were still close. On the third night, I found shelter in the ruins of an old stone chapel, nothing left but broken walls and a collapsed roof. I collapsed in a corner, too exhausted to move, the cold seeping through every layer of my clothes. My hands trembled as I unfolded Vasilei's map again, the edges worn from being clutched too tightly. I was close, less than 30 kilometers from the southern border. If I could make it across the countryside before morning, I'd have a shot at blending in, disappearing into one of the small towns along the edges of Moldova's forgotten roads. But that's when I heard it. Crunch. Not a twig, not a gust of wind. Boot steps. My body moved on instinct. I rolled behind a broken pew, pressing my back against the crumbling stone as a flashlight beam swept across the ruins. Tracks end here, a voice muttered, low and sharp. Too close. They were here. I didn't wait to be caught. I crawled toward the back of the chapel, keeping my head low as another voice, this one calmer, more professional, barked out an order. Fan out. He's hurt. He won't get far. My pulse hammered in my ears. My boots scraped against the damp stone floor as I slipped through a gap in the broken wall, every muscle screaming from days of running without rest. The cold night air hit me like a slap, sharp and biting. I ran. Not fast, my body couldn't manage that anymore, but with the desperate, broken rhythm of a man who had nothing left except fear. The fields opened up ahead of me, rows of dead crops stretching toward the tree line in the distance. I didn't dare look back. The gunshot came fast. The first round tore past my ear, the sharp crack echoing through the open night like thunder. The second hit the dirt just behind me, showering me with soil and stone. I dove behind a low ridge, rolling into the tall grass as the voices grew louder, closer. He's down by the hill. The dogs barked again, closer than before. I couldn't outrun them now. But I could hide. The minutes stretched into hours as I crawled through the grass, inch by painful inch. I could hear them behind me, cursing, shouting, the dogs' howls cutting through the silence like knives. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voices stopped. The forest swallowed them whole. By dawn, I reached the tree line, shaking, fever burning in my veins, but alive. The border was close. I could feel it in my bones. But the worst part? I knew they weren't done hunting me yet.